Thank you, everybody, for that very warm welcome, and it's great to be back at M.A.D E and especially here with our 22nd Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser. Malcolm and I had a discussion at the Wheeler Centre on Tuesday night, and it's especially delightful to have a day to think about that and to keep going this evening.
It wasn't even an argument.
It wasn't an argument. Do we need that microphone just a little bit closer? A little bit. Yeah.
Is that better?
That sounds like it's better. No, it wasn't an argument, and I know you like an argument, so...
I don't mind if we don't have an argument.
Yeah, good, because I don't know how I'd come out the other end of that, frankly. Look, since we're here at Eureka, at the Museum of Australian Democracy, it seems as good a place to start to ask you about how you think Australian democracy is going right now. We're going to get into our sovereignty, which is in peril, according to you. But how is our democracy going?
I'd love to be able to say well, but not well. And it's not the institutions, it's not a 3-year parliament. I think a lot of it is people. There are so many people now who make a career out of politics. And it's not a normal career. I mean, they don't go and become independent, become doctors or carpenters or plumbers, and having demonstrated to themselves, which is the important thing, that they can make a livelihood and thus walk away from politics if they have to. They go to university, get a job with a member of parliament, get a job with, this is both parties, both major parties, get a job with the union or the organisation, build up some brownie points, get pre-selection, become a member of parliament. They've never done anything outside of politics. When I went in the Labour Party, the union people there were people who'd worked with their hands and probably left school at 13 or 14.
Chifley was a train driver, wasn't he?
He was a train driver. Clyde Cameron was a rouseabout, a very young rouseabout. I think he left school at 13 and became head of the AWU. He was one of the best debaters I've ever heard. And there were all sorts of people, but they had worked with their hands. They knew what hard work was all about. The academic, I'm not against degrees, I'm all for them, but the academic trade union leader doesn't really know the kind of life that his own union membership has. He's never had that kind of life. He's had a different kind of life, but just got a job from them. And that creates a different sort of person. And so it is with the Liberal Party. So on that level, just look, one example I've used before. Last pre-selection for Higgins, one acceptable candidate, one not. The acceptable one was liked by the former member, liked by the organisation. 3 or 4 other people were persuaded not to throw their hat in the ring. Go back 25 years, the director of the party in Victoria would have said, what? Only one candidate for Higgins, blue ribbon seat in the centre of Melbourne? I'm going to postpone this pre-selection and we'll end up with a dozen good candidates so the electorate will have a proper choice. And that would have been the proper answer. But that person probably would have been independent, would have achieved things in their own right, and you get a different kind of... But you see, one of the differences when I joined it, and I wasn't one of the people I'm just describing because I was a kid during the last World War. But people who had known the Depression, 30% unemployment, then known the war, for many the war was the first job they had, first ever job they had. And then the hardship of the 30s, the difficulties and dangers of the war, when people have been through these things and get into the parliament, they've been through their own hellfire. They're not going to be frightened of Menzies or McEwen or Chifley or Curtin or Evatt or anyone. They're people who have their views, they'll express it, and they'll work for it. And they know they can do something else if it doesn't work out. We don't have that sort of parliament anymore, but we have new things. I set out there when I was looking at the exhibitions, which I think are absolutely wonderful, a wonderful learning lesson for everyone, and I wouldn't mind spending a day going through those various panels. I'd learn a lot that I just don't know and probably should know. But America's gone further down the track than we have, but we are, what the role of money in a democracy. I don't know how to define a democracy, because Menzies started the Liberal Party and said those who raise money are here, but those who are members of Parliament, making policy, are here. And in a real sense, in the organisation, the two did not meet. In my electorate, I had a Warren campaign committee and I attended its meetings. There was a Warren finance committee. I couldn't even name the members. I never attended a meeting. They raised the money. The campaign committee would put in a budget and they'd say, no, that's too much, you can't spend that much. You've got to spend less. And when you're going around, don't ever ask for money. It's not your job. Your job's to talk about what people's concerns are and what the policy of the party is or what you'd like it to be, but don't get into the business. Now, members, I think in New South Wales, senators are given a quota of money they have to raise, and if they don't, affect pre-selection. Now, you've only got to look at it in the broadest terms. So let's say I'm a senator for New South Wales. A developer comes in. This might be too near the bone for what's going on at the moment, but they've supported my campaign. Then they come in and ask for a change of policy, a support for this and a support for that. It's going to take a brave Senate candidate who will say no.
It's a lot of dependency, isn't it? That this creates everything you've just talked about creates dependency on the system. As I'm listening to you, what you're talking about in the book, the big theme of this book, of course, is Australia's dependency on America, on a way of doing things, on a way of thinking through a relationship, and you can sort of. It seems like people get stuck in a way and can't see their way out of it. Tell us about the almost a century, more than a century of strategic dependence that you write about in your book, Dangerous Allies. You say that, I'm quoting from you, that it's left an indelible mark on the Australian psyche. We almost crave a great and powerful friend. It's a part of who we are as a nation.
Well, when we started, of course, we were a convict colony, weren't we? We were part of the empire, and then we got self-governing colonies so far as domestic affairs were concerned. But whether we were self-governing colonies or a federated Australia, we were still dependent upon Britain for foreign policy and defence. There was no effective Department of Foreign Affairs until M.A.D.E. established it after the Second World War. In the First World War, when Britain declared war, she declared war for the empire. As a federated, for a while I had thought that on federation we became independent. But oh no, we still approached Britain. Look, I'm not anti-British, but I've got it almost on our knees through the Colonial Office. So we were just a bigger colony to them. And the empire conferences were still, for some years after Federation, called colonial conferences. They expected us to approach third countries, third parties, through the British Colonial Office, and they would make up their minds whether they should pass the message or the request or whatever on. And Deakin, on one occasion, perhaps being aware of this, and hearing that the Americans were going to send a fleet round the world as a publicity exercise for America, it was called the Great White Fleet, I think, in the early 1900s. He approached America direct, and the Americans were pleased at this because they didn't really like the British all that much, and to be asked by a member of the British Empire for their fleet to visit Melbourne and Sydney, well, that pleased. So they said yes pretty quickly. And then the British heard of it, and Deakin got into all sorts of trouble. He'd crossed the boundaries. You know, he could have been expelled if he was at school for such a grave and serious offence.
He sort of did his best, Deakin, didn't he? But all within the confines of the Imperial agenda in the end.
Right up to, even Menzies would argue that Australia can best exercise its influence as part of a powerful empire rather than as an Australian voice speaking to the world. But in theory that might be fine. But in practice, if you have one large nation, which Britain was, and the rest all much smaller, certainly without a navy to challenge the British, without an army or whatever, although in war we were expected to contribute to both, and when Britain declared war, we were automatically at war, and even for the Second War, virtually. You know, they might listen to you because that's part of the business of keeping the empire together. But the listening to does not mean taking into account your views, because the decision they make is purely made on their interest, not on our interest.
Well, you give example after example after example in the book, both with Great Britain but also the United States and everyone else, that there's never been a superpower, a hegemon, or in fact even a more powerful nation than another that hasn't put its own interests first.
Well, you've got to expect that.
But why don't our politicians expect that then? Why do they seem to think that when President Obama comes to our parliament or stands up in Darwin to announce a new naval base and says Australia is the closest friend that we have, and we know he's said it in South Korea and he's said it in Israel and he's said it in France and he's said it in Norway, why do we, I mean, do we think we're special to America?
Oh, yes. And we're special to America when there's nobody else in the room. But if there's somebody else in the room, both of us are special to America. And so it goes on. You know, I read something since I wrote that, and only in the last day or two, where an American was saying, quite a senior American, Australia is the best kind of ally. They just do what we expect of them. They don't argue about it, they just do it. That puts you in a very special position. In other words, we're the most compliant little puppy dog in the world. And that, you know, I suppose I've always been rebellious. That just offends me. It's not a question of offence to me, because now I know it is the reverse of what is necessary for Australia's security and Australian survival. And we followed America into 3 absolutely disastrous wars. Iraq was on the basis, I will continue to assert while I'm on this earth, of a publicly known lie. There were several aspects of the campaign to say they had weapons of mass destruction, which we knew to be false. And if there were arguments being put that we knew to be false, it probably meant the whole argument was at fault. And they wouldn't let Hans Blix finish his inquiry examination at a time when he was getting more cooperation from Iraq. No, we're not going to wait for that. We're going to go ahead. The British Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Sir Michael Boyce, said he would not order British troops to invade until he was assured the war would be legal under British and international law. And he was basically given a lie. The British Attorney General, a week or two before, had given a 14-page opinion which said on the one hand this, on the one hand that, certainly not the kind of advice that the Commander-in-Chief wanted. And then one page, 334 words appeared which said, yes, legal under all sorts of law. Well, who wrote that one page? It had the British Attorney General's name under it. It was tabled in the Australian Parliament, but Goldsmith, the alleged author, later said it was not a condensation of his legal opinion. So questions arise, was it written in Blair's office, who wanted to go to war, just to make sure there wouldn't be an argument with the Commander-in-Chief? But there were a lot of things, and there's no point in going through them all. That was on the basis of a lie. Vietnam, if Harold Holt had learnt what I know now, John Fain this morning got one thing wrong. He said that I'd made the decision to go to Vietnam. I actually wasn't even in the government when they made a decision to go into Vietnam, but I did become the minister or the defence minister who had to administer it. And I supported the decision on the knowledge I had at the time and the belief we had about communism in general. There were a lot of things we didn't understand properly about communism. But even the CIA had been saying that, the Vietnamese and nationalist movement, they have made up their minds to endure any hardship, any sacrifice, if necessary, interminably into the future, to establish the independence of Vietnam. They were sick of the French, they beat the French at Dien Bien Phu, then they weren't going to allow what they thought was America or an American puppet destroy their dream of their independence. Now, that was a CIA view. The CIA is in two almost separate divisions.
Malcolm, can I ask, at what point did you change your mind about Vietnam? Did you stop and think what I did, what I supported then as Minister for Defence? Was there a key moment?
It would have been when I saw the fabrications going on about getting out, victory with honour, when it was total defeat. But America said, this defeat is in fact a victory with honour.
I thought you were talking about Iraq then, or Afghanistan.
Well, they probably said that too. That was both. Might be a practice.
I mean, you're scathing about the language and the tone of American exceptionalism and this idea of the God-given right of America. And you can trace it through those three examples.
But it goes back to the foundation of America. But the thing that makes it difficult or dangerous is that America, during the Cold War, was restrained by the existence of the Soviet Union as an equal and sometimes an even more powerful superpower. But with the breakup of the Soviet Union, there's no challenger to the United States. 40% of the world's defense expenditure is American. Why? What's the threat to America? Chinese expenditure is 8%. With very dangerous borders and sometimes very dangerous countries on our borders, none of which America has. So in some ways, China's 8% is infinitely more understandable than America's 40%. But America, on top of the greasy pole by herself, determined to stay there because rules are for lesser mortals, like you and me, for lesser countries, like Australia, New Zealand, or Indonesia. Rules are not for America, because what America does is right, because America does it, because we only do. I heard Jean Kirkpatrick say America has never been to war except to fight for the freedom and liberty of other people. What about all the Indians that were subjected and destroyed and killed and put into reservations? What about the Philippines that they took by armed conflict with the most horrific casualties from Spain? What about areas that were taken from France and wars with Mexico? In her own continent, America has fought wars to expand the American empire. And to say that they have never been to war except to fight for the freedom of other people, well, I'm sure Jean Kirkpatrick believes it. And it's that makes it so dangerous. You know, when Japan declared or attacked Pearl Harbor, America declared war on Japan, but not on Germany. It was Germany that brought America into the German war by declaring war on America in support of Japan.
It's never been clear, has it, what they would have done if that hadn't have happened?
Well, without Pearl Harbor, I've had Americans in the last few years say to me, of course we wouldn't have gone to war. Why would we have gone to war? When MacArthur came to Australia, our only interest in Australia is a takeoff point for beating Japan. And that, I'm sure, was correct. It was the extent of the interest. But when a country regards itself as exceptional, with more power than any other, more sense of right on its side, it makes it dangerous because they do it, it is right. It has to be good because we do not do bad things. Why did they wait for 2.5 years, leaving Britain fighting alone against Nazi Germany?
Well, in relation to Australia, one of the really strong parts of this book is the argument you make about the ANZUS Treaty, which if you read the book, which I'm sure you will, Mr. Fraser says to read it, and I'd never read it, the whole treaty. It's actually not very long at all. And an astonishing, I just didn't know that it was, all it is a document, an understanding to consult. There is absolutely nothing there in ink that says that America has to come and look after Australia should anything happen. In fact, in the treaty it says that, in fact, they've got to look after Japan, not even Australia. So tell us about, in terms of our interests, would America be there for us? Because that's what politicians on both sides lead us to believe.
Well, they do, but it's worth noting the wars we have fought with America, because of America, have had absolutely nothing to do with ANZUS. Vietnam was never part of it. It covered Australian or American troops or territory in the Pacific Theatre. That was the geographic limit of the understanding, the treaty, but it was a commitment to consult. In America, you'd need a war powers resolution through the Parliament before they could even consider helping us with military support. So it's an extraordinarily weak treaty, but no Australian government wants all of us to believe that it's a weak treaty, which it is. Japan has a much stronger treaty with America. And NATO is an absolute commitment to consult if any member country of NATO is under attack. The others are all pre-obliged to go to that country's help. So it's a totally different instrument with different obligations. Something again which no government is going to want Australians to understand. I know 3 occasions in which America has chosen Indonesia over Australia. Now, you might find that hard to believe. With what we're told, how possibly could America choose Indonesia over Australia? Now, the first was over Borneo, when our troops were fighting in confrontation in support of the independence of Malaysia. And the people our troops were fighting were allegedly irregulars. but they were in fact extraordinarily well-trained members of the Indonesian armed forces. And I think Indonesia at the time had probably like 1.5 million men under arms. And I was army minister at that time, and I'd said, well, look, you know, how good are they or how bad are they? They said the top 300,000 are as good as any you could possibly meet. Then there's a middle range, not so good, and the tail end is pretty ordinary. There was, in the course of writing this book, I came across some reports of a meeting between Governor Harriman, who was Deputy Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, and McEwen, John McEwen, Menzies, I think Barwick. Anyway, the documents are all in my office. And at the end of a long discussion, John McEwen got to the nub of the issue, as he normally would, more precisely than most others. And he said, well, Governor Harriman, he liked being called governor, he'd been governor of New York. Governor, you've said that if there's an outright invasion of Australia by Indonesia, of course ANZUS would apply and you'd come to our assistance. But that's not the sort of position we're likely to be in. It's likely to be a condition of infiltration, of unofficial warfare, almost denying there's a war, but there could well be efficient, well-trained units of the Indonesian army, but nobody declares war. And if that's what we're confronted, would you help us or would you not? And Governor Harriman's response, and this is fairly much verbatim, well, Mr. McEwen, you've got to the nub of the issue, and we are nearing the end of our meeting, which had gone on, it had been a long meeting, 3 or 4 hours. And I believe that in the time remaining, I could not find words to give you a sufficiently precise answer and an accurate answer to your most perceptive question. Now, that's a very polite way of saying no, isn't it? Over West Irian, where we believed there should be, and for a while the Menzies government fought for, a genuine act of self-determination. Now, the Dutch certainly weren't going to support this. The British weren't going to support this because they supported colonial powers re-establishing themselves after the war, which they shouldn't have done. The Americans, they weren't going to support us. In the end, the compromise was an act of self-determination that was a farce, because it was going to come out supporting incorporation with Indonesia. And that was the second. And the third, which I had confirmed to me by a member of the government at the time, and a very senior member of the government at the time, but I'd known it before, had not had it confirmed by somebody so directly involved, was over East Timor, where John Howard took some actions that led to the independence of East Timor, fragile and difficult as it is. And we were needing transport, for heavy lift transport, and it took enormous persuading to get America to provide that transport because it would offend Indonesia. So 3 occasions. Now, in relation to confrontation, The Economist wrote in 1961 or 1963, and I suspect the comment is still valid, Australia is utterly deluding herself if she thinks that America will ever support Australia over Indonesia unless Indonesia is governed by an openly and obviously and blatant communist government. Well, that's not reality, because communism is not a worldwide force, it's not a threat of any kind today. And therefore that makes that statement in The Economist, which is not an entirely ignorant commentator on international events, much more pertinent today than it might have been 40, 50 years ago.
What you're telling us is that Australia is not a sovereign nation. That is that's a radical thing for a former Prime Minister to say.
The reason we're not a sovereign nation is that if the Australian Prime Minister, let's say that, Hugh White thought this could happen last year. And Hugh White is a cautious, sober, and knowledgeable commentator on strategic matters from the National University and formerly the Defence Department. Let's say a provocative Japan, or if you like, a provocative China, and there's an armed conflict over those rocks in the East China Sea, and America supports Japan, as they have said they would. Now, let's say the Australian Prime Minister does as he ought to. Well, this one we're going to let pass over our shoulder. We're not going to go to war on this one. And then the Americans use those troops in that task force in Darwin. Can we say we are not complicit in what those troops do, what they attack, what they bomb or destroy? We've housed them. We've made it easier for the Americans.
Well, we wouldn't even know if we were complicit, I suppose, would we?
The very fact they take off from Australian soil. They're not going to ask us first. They'll use them, and then we have to bear the consequences. And the other thing, of course, which I think is even more important and in some ways harder to overcome, is the current use of Pine Gap. Now, all my political life, which ended more years ago than I was in the Parliament, in other words, about 32 or 3 years, I think you said that
33, I did the figures for you the other day, yes.
Up to then anyway, Pine Gap was information collecting, early warning of strategic missiles, maybe from Russia, and it was a good operation. But changes in weapon technology, changes in communications technology, which we all understand today because we all have these wretched little mobile phones which we can't get away from and can't put down. You see, I've got mine here with me, but it's on silent, so don't worry about it.
It's because he's a tweeter.
No, I don't tweet on that.
He's got his own tweeting phone.
It's an iPad. But as a result of these changes in technology and advances in what Pine Gap can do, it has become integral to the aiming of a variety of American weapon systems, including to the targeting of drone attacks. You know, people meet in the White House, somebody who thought he knew about the way drones operated, and has been involved with Australian drones, which are just intelligence gathering in relation to field intelligence in an active theatre of war, and that's fine, that's great. But somebody in the White House comes along with a list. Star Chamber, don't know who they are, say, well, these seem to be the most dangerous people at the moment. We should target them. We know how to target them. They actually are using a phone, or they've got. So if we watch out for them, we'll be able to get them over the next week or two. Now, nobody knows what the evidence is. There's no possibility of defence. There's no court of law. There's no rule of law. And they're probably going to be in a country with whom we, or even America, are at peace. Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia. Well, the Australians who were killed were in Yemen. And most of Australia just seemed to shrug, well, you know, if they're going to hang around with people who are terrorists, if they get killed, that's too bad. But there is a question of proof, there is a question of the rule of law. And if Australians from Pine Gap are involved in that, they're involved in something which is totally illegal, maybe one day could get to the International Criminal Court. There have been efforts from Pakistan to get some of the killings there before British courts. And the British court where they tried this just said very nicely, in a totally non-legal judgment, well, we're not going to be able to hear this case because it would upset a powerful ally. But the whole operation is secret. And, you know, there are contradictions. President Obama, to his credit, got rid of the extradition, the rendition program. Otherwise, you'd probably find a couple of great big black American vehicles out there after this evening, and I'd get whisked away, never to be seen again. Maybe my ghost would get to Guantanamo Bay or something. But he stopped that program of rendition.
But he's droned more people than any other president.
Well, it's only two presidents who've used them in this way.
Although to outbeat Bush on that, you've got to be impressive, don't you?
Well, about 4 times more than Bush. And so why he thinks one is evil, which at least wasn't meant to be a killing program, at least till they'd killed under torture. And the other one is straight out international murder. Now, the Americans might have legal cover through a War Powers resolution relating to 9/11. That doesn't give Australians any cover, but whether it gives cover or not, you know, these kinds of weapons are not all that expensive. You get to a stage where 20, 30, 40 countries have these sorts of weapons. Long before that happens, we have got to have some international convention which totally outlaws drone killings. And if we could get that agreed next year, which is total fantasy, I suspect we could get nearly every country in the world to sign on to it, with the exception of the United States. And we, who are complicit.
The ideas that you're putting forward, and it's a very detailed book, this. There's an entire history of Australia and our alliances, and it's incredibly an enormous amount of work in this book. The ideas in it undoubtedly would appeal to millions of Australians. I mean, who knows what percentage, how many? Certainly many more than just millions question the alliance with the US, what side they sort of fall in their thinking, but they question it. And many millions seriously question it. Why is it that in our parties, in our party leadership, in the organisations of our politics, there is just no room, it seems, to question? What is the divide between the Australian people, who seem to be far more grown up in examining this relationship, and our politics, where it is a sort of no-go area, where you would be unelectable as a leader of your party with the views you express, but very electable to the people of Australia?
I've got no chance of being elected as leader.
Let me tell you, Malcolm, no chance. No chance.
I wouldn't get endorsed as a candidate for the Liberal Party, or for that matter, for the Labor Party on this issue. Not for either of them.
And not just this issue, actually, but go on. Yeah.
Well, in the late 40s and the early 50s, before the split in the Labor Party, the Labor Party almost certainly politically, because of, you know, I can't be accused of having an antipathetic feeling to Dr. Evatt. There's a chapter about Dr. Evatt for great things he did in relation to the United Nations. He got an editorial in the New York Times of a kind that no other Australian ever has.
For anything.
Praising him right up to the skies for his role as leader of small nations, pushing an argument as hard as he could in their interests, but never going so far that he would destroy what people were trying to achieve. He knew when to pull back. And for that alone, he deserves our thanks. But later, you know, a bit erratic perhaps, and when he pulled a letter out of his pocket and quoted Mr. Molotov, foreign minister, saying that there were no Russian spies in Australia. Well, I suppose, you know, there were Russian spies everywhere. There were American spies everywhere. And relying on a Russian foreign minister just indicated a certain lack of balance. And the Labour Party suffered through the years of the split, and the rump of the Labour Party clearly was regarded as too close to Moscow, too close to communism. And they suffered from that. But now they've made sure they don't suffer from that anymore, and they're just as close to the United States as anyone else. And to criticise the United States, when things that are argued about in America, and vigorously between senior Americans, if you use the same arguments here, somebody will jump up and say, "Oh, you're anti-American, are you?" and try and shut you down and try and stop you speaking. And, in America, there are a group of people, very, very senior. They've gone through American courts, and so far the court order is saying that President Obama has to publish all the legal documents that he got out of the Justice Department which justify him killing Americans with drones in foreign countries. No, he's not published it yet, but this court order came down about 10 days ago. And so people are fighting for that. Now, nobody is fighting to find the legal justification for killing a couple of Australians in the Yemen. Nobody in Australia says boo about the issue. And
so what is it then? Why that divide? Why are politicians so far away from are they just sort of flattered? Is it a glimpse into the Oval Office and they're weak at the knees, or a whisper in the ear from Obama?
There's a touch of that in it. But I also think the United States, over a long period of years, has been very good at infiltrating ideas and thoughts and attitudes of mind into powerful sections of the Australian bureaucracy, certainly into powerful sections of the Australian military. Although I also know there are people in the military who have written concept papers on a quite different kind of defence policy who do not like the dependence that's been created. But does anyone here know that an active serving Australian Major General is second in charge of 60,000 American troops operating in the Western Pacific? So we know all their plans, all their operations. If he got pulled out because we don't like what the Americans are doing, that would leave a hole. They could fill it, but it would obviously create embarrassment on both sides. But he shouldn't be there in the first place because it creates obligations which we should not allow. We have a frigate for about a third of each year on station with USS Washington, which is stationed in some Japanese harbour, patrols up and down the East China Sea. And talk of provocation, if the Chinese had an aircraft carrier as big as USS Washington and patrolled up and down just outside the territorial limit, the 12-mile limit, where you could be seen from land on a clear day without too much difficulty. They're huge, those things. On the east coast of America, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if America didn't say, we're going to declare war unless you get that thing out of here. They'd be paranoid with concern. But that's done daily and whatever. And I do not understand, because this compliance did not exist before the breakup of the Soviet Union. And the tragic thing about it all is that the depth of it, the troops in Darwin, the changes in Pine Gap, and the interoperability or the stationing of Australian senior officers with American forces, all of that's happened within the last 20 years. It wasn't there before. So it's much harder to disentangle now than it would have been in 1990 when the Soviet Union disappeared. And why? Governments obviously liked it because, it was Julia Gillard who put the troops in Darwin, and she was very chuffed. If you read,
with absolutely no debate. It was
if you read Bob Carr's book, she had to be quite a skillful operation to prevent her going up to Darwin to welcome the first troops, saying, "Here I am, Australia loves you," and President Obama's speech from the Australian Parliament made the kind of speech that nobody should ever make from a foreign parliament.
Paul Keating...
To me, it was a gross discourtesy, and the Australian government should never have allowed it.
Paul Keating argued that very strongly as well, and it wasn't picked up on. It seems that with these, somebody will say that and it actually won't be looked at.
Well, look, we have the Age, which is now sacking a lot of journalists and a lot of photographers, so that's irrelevant, I know. But the Fairfax Group is not the strongest media force in the world.
Let's hope not.
We have new media. You mean to the sackings?
No, let's hope not to the sackings, and that they're not the weakest in the world, or the world's in deeper trouble than even I think.
Well, they're not. They've got a good website, but the powerful paper, which makes losses, and they don't mind because it's a very wealthy corporation. It's called The Australian, but is it Australian or is it American? I think in some of the views it expresses, it's almost Tea Party. But, there's an old story, which is not a story, it's true. In the 1950s, a British company was going to buy a huge chain of 4 radio stations. And this was creating a fuss. And Menzies was concerned about it. So people were demanding legislation to stop foreign investment in Australian media. So Ming came into the Parliament. He didn't pass any legislation. But his words went something like this: the government has decided that it is quite wrong, and he wouldn't say the British, but for people who do not belong to this country to own such a powerful medium of propaganda, which can spread all sorts of ideas which may not be in our interests. Australian media should be Australian. Now, all right, old-fashioned views. But I think we'd be in a lot healthier position if we'd always said that in relation to the media, it should be owned by countries
homegrown.
The Singapore Straits Times, the Singaporeans are very good at they've got Class A shares, Class B shares. I don't know which are which, but the shares that control policy are owned by the government, and you or I or anyone can own the other shares and make good money out of it. But to own the shares that control the paper, you've got to be Singaporean. And I believe that's as it should be. How can you be a country? I mean, take it to an extreme, if you like, and you say, the Age has a powerful benefactor from the Tea Party, and it's irresistible to the current shareholders. Any other independent media get bought up. Where is your independent voice? All right, you can Twitter, but, that's pretty small beer, really. And if it's good enough for newspapers, it's good enough for television. There are some things where it is not appropriate for the assets to be owned or controlled by people who do not belong to this country and who do not have their hearts in the future of this country above all others. Above all others.
I'm terribly grateful, and I'm sure everybody here tonight is, that you've exerted your independence yet again, and that you've given your time tonight, as you do on so many occasions, to come and explain your ideas and your thoughts. And just before I hand over to Jane, again, just to really encourage everybody to read this book. So I really congratulate you and thank you, Malcolm Fraser.
Thank you, Sally.